I love this quote, but those who don't know history are destined to repeat it. And they talk about the idea that history repeats itself. So if we don't really understand history, if we don't know where we came from, then what we're going to do is what we're doing right now, which is making the same mistakes over again. I laugh sometimes when I think, oh my God, we already did this. I can't believe people are arguing about this again. But then you realize that the people that are arguing are probably in their 20s or in their 30s and don't realize that, wow, this was something that people disagreed about in the 1970s or in the 1980s. So I started lifting weights in the 1970s. I started as a strength and conditioning coach, I believe, in 1983. So I'm in my 40th year of actually being a hands-on strength and conditioning. Actually, no, I left my 40. This is the start of the 42nd or 43rd. So I've lived through the history. And I always say, when people, I had a guy at a podcast one time say, well, what's the biggest technological breakthrough that you can think about during the time you've been involved in the field? And I said, well, either the cell phone or the computer. And the guy just kind of looked at me like, what? I said, well, you don't understand. When I started doing this, there was no such thing as a cellular phone, and I had never seen a personal computer. We did have a computer lab at Springfield College in the 80s. The computer lab was in the basement of a building, and the computer comprised a large portion of that basement, if you can imagine what these ancient mainframe computers looked like. So when we suddenly were able to buy a personal computer, or to even have a cell phone that was capable of taking a picture, I guess even a cell phone that was you didn't have to go, you didn't have to walk to the phone. So when you really think about history, I mean, we had yellow legal pads and pencils. So sometimes people think, well, what did you do with testing? And I'm like, well, we wrote the guys' names down, and then we wrote the number next to their name. So I wrote Mike Boyle, and Mike Boyle benched 250 pounds. So I wrote Mike Boyle benched 250. And that was how we kept track. And at that time, if we were lucky enough, maybe the secretary from one of the sports teams might type up the data for us. So we actually had a typewritten copy of that. But we would mimeograph sheets. Most guys don't even know what a mimeograph even is. Imagine a hand-operated photocopier is probably the best way to describe a mimeograph machine, where you were literally rolling out these smelly copies of whatever thing you put in there first. And our first timer had a wire. So we had a 40-yard wire. We had a hand start pad that plugged into the finish timer, and we had to drag out. So we were rolling wire up every time we timed 40s. We'd have a big spool of wire. We'd roll the wire back up. We'd put the timer back in its box, and then we'd bring it back out again when we wanted to time again. So I think that's the stuff that people have to realize when you start thinking about what was the past like. That was the past. So this is, people start always talking about West Side this and West Side that. And people don't realize West Side was in California. Louis Simmons took the name West Side Barbell Club from the original West Side Barbell Club. Box squats were invented by George Friend and Roger Estep, who were powerlifters in the 70s. So, and again, people talk as if West Side is history, but the reality is West Side Barbell, as we knew it, as many of us knew it, was second generation history. Our football line, we used to have everybody run a 1.5 mile run. I'm embarrassed when I say that now. That's why now when people are always talking about zone 2 and we need to do more cardio and blah, blah, blah. And I think, my God, I spent my entire career trying to stop people from getting explosive athletes aerobically fit. I fought that for the first 20 years of my career. And suddenly now you're thinking about people going back and saying, oh, we need to do more aerobic work. And I literally want to smack myself when I think about that. And I realized, but these people don't know the history. They didn't watch our 280 and 290 pound guys try to run a 1.5 miles under 12 minutes or something like that, some absurd standard that we had set for them. When I first started in hockey, teams hired exercise scientists. That's what they hired. They hired physiologists from a school who came in and did VO2 max testing. They brought Monarch bikes, and they brought, air hoses and masks and all these things. And they tested these guys for VO2 max. And I always think one of the worst things that ever happened in hockey, and probably one of the best things that ever happened to me, this is obviously American ice hockey, is the logic was completely wrong. One of the things that they determined was that, hey, these guys aren't very fit. They don't have very good VO2s. And so for 20 years, the National Hockey League chased VO2 max as a stat and really held on to this belief that a high VO2 made you a better hockey player. So they literally thought that having the endurance capacity of a world-class cyclist or a world-class rower or a world-class distance runner was what was essential to being a world-class hockey player. They were completely wrong. But that was where we were. We did people with, Williams flexion exercises for low back pain. I mean, like the total opposite of what you would want to do. Yet there was a time period in the 1980s when everybody, oh yeah, your back is sore, okay, do one knee to chest, other knee to chest, both knees to chest. Try to get your spine more flexible. And then on top of that, then we'll just think, okay, we'll just get your abs stronger and your spine more flexible and your back pain will go away. There's been so much water under the bridge and nobody saw the water. So they had very, very little understanding of what was going on. Companies like Perform Better didn't exist. Perform Better, Black Box, these people, they weren't even out there. You couldn't buy. We had to kind of find ways to get plyometric equipment. How do we get hurdles? There was no such thing as a mini hurdle. There was a hurdle. I'll show you a video. Well, actually, I'll show you the video because this is actually pretty interesting. This was, we talk about, I was talking to somebody else. This was the first VHS tape that I made probably in 1990. Need this, but when you start thinking, even we were filming videos. The reason this is as limited as it is because that was all we could get with a camcorder. But we were trying to think about, okay, we're going to film exercises that athletes can do, and we're going to film. This was our kind of our plyometric series. And the reason I show you when we get to hurdle hops, you'll see how we made low hurdles when you talk about history. Okay, this was low hurdles. How do you get low hurdles? You flip your high hurdles over on their side and you make low hurdles. And then you look and think, how do we make high hurdles? Well, we just took the same hurdles and we stood them up again. But you couldn't, as I said, you couldn't even buy this stuff. You couldn't source it. And so a company like Perform Better literally evolved. I remember the first meeting I had with the Perform Better used to be a track company. They basically did track and field. They sold hurdles and discus and shot put and javelins and high jump pits and all of these things. And Bill Falk, the guy who had owned Perform Better at that time, was a track coach and said, we're going to develop another catalog for strength and conditioning coaches because we think there's a need. We think, we've got all these strength and conditioning coaches buying track stuff all the time. And we want you to have your own stuff. You couldn't buy a plyo box. You had to make them. We made my first set of plyo boxes. I remember going to Home Depot and buying sheets of plywood and getting the saw out and cutting up. Okay, I'm going to cut these ones 24 by 18 and these ones 24 by 24, and I'm going to put some studs inside them and build them. And all the plyo boxes that we had, we built. And now you look at it and you think you can get metal plyo boxes, wood plyo boxes, soft plyo boxes. You can get hurdles from 3 inches to whatever, 36 inches, and you're just picking them out of a catalog. So there was so much of this stuff that people, I think, now take for granted. The other thing, information came from magazines. Imagine waiting. I used to wait a month for information because that was when the next Ironman or the next Strength and Health or the next Muscle and Fitness would come out. I can remember there was we called them smoke shops, and they were basically places that sold cigarettes and magazines. But I used to consistently go to the smoke shop and look on the shelves and see, okay, is there a new Ironman in there? Is there a new Strength and Health there? Is there a new Muscle and Fitness there? Has the new magazine come out for this month yet? There was no internet. So this is, it's crazy, but you think, and that's in powerlifting and Olympic lifting were regularly on television. Prior to the World's Strongest Man, which still isn't really on TV anymore, but you would see competitive powerlifting and Olympic lifting, at least in the United States, on what was called Wide World of Sports. And on Saturday afternoons, you might be able to watch the National Powerlifting Championships or the World Weightlifting Championships. So we didn't realize we were being influenced by bodybuilding and powerlifting and Olympic lifting, but we were, because that was all we saw. In 1982, strength coaching was a part-time job. The two people that I knew who got strength coach jobs in 1982 both got part-time jobs. They had another, one of them was working for two different pro sports teams, so he was part-time with two teams, and another one was the track field event coach, and then the football strength coach. So it was very, very different. Other things I always think, in the pre-steroid era, bodybuilders did really basic exercises heavy. And there was none of this sort of bombing and blitzing. I always say to everybody, the whole hypertrophy thing to me is a figment of the steroid user's imagination. This idea, like we think, oh, if we just do more sets, we'll get bigger. I look and think that is the dumbest idea ever. I've never seen that work for anybody except a guy using steroids or a natural responder. Like some guys respond to weights. If we look kind of our NFL guys, our NFL is filled with responders. They're just guys who I always think they look at weights and they get bigger. But in general, we found the exact opposite. When somebody needs to get bigger, we end up having to do less. Okay, let's eat more, do less, and give them more time to recover as opposed to do more. And then the last one I put in, because this is a bit tongue in cheek, and somebody may take me up on this later on, but when somebody tore their ACL, they were told they would never squat again, and their rehab was open chain isokinetics. And the reason I have that oops in there is because we're back to that. I think it's amazing, but I think ACL rehab has regressed because suddenly we're back to isolated joint testing, Cybex testing, and orthotron testing, and looking at things like quad hamstring ratios that I thought we'd never go back to again. So that's one of those things when we think of history where we've actually, I believe, regressed. In 1982, I knew two people who had part-time strength coach jobs, and there was no full-time strength coaches in New England. I think the only full-time strength coach that I knew of at that time was Boyd Epley at Nebraska, who is widely credited with being the first person to do it.